Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to our course on Jews and American Mass Media with Dr. Ayelet Brinn. We are in session 3 of this course. And our topic for today is early film and radio, which I think promises to be very fun. I don't have any particular logistics to convey to you all except the usual, which we've come to find a kind of mode here where we're asking everyone to stay muted, but you can put your questions and comments in the chat at any point during the talk. I think Ayelet will be soliciting some comments and some feedback at some point during her presentation, and I'll be sort of translating the chat into oral questions for her and trying to find a moment to ask any other questions that come up. I should mention that the CAT Center has some other public programs going on right now. I'm going to type the, actually I'll ask Diana to type a link into the chat letting you know how to find news about upcoming lectures in the series on Jews and the America to come, of which there is one this evening and another one next week. So without taking any more of our hour, I'll just turn things over to Ayelet. Ayelet, are you coming?
There we go. I was having trouble unmuting myself. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to share my screen and then we'll get started. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. Good to see you all again. I want to start by thanking you so much for being so responsive and engaged last week. I thought that added a lot to our discussion. So because of that, I'll be asking for your thoughts again at various points during the lecture. And as a reminder, when I prompt you, I'll ask you to type your responses into the chat so that Anne can read them out to me. And that's how we'll have some sort of interactive conversation. So today we're going to focus on the rise of new forms of commercial entertainment at the turn of the 20th century, especially early film and radio. We'll explore the connection of these cultural transformations to mass migration, industrialization, and the changing work patterns of working class urban American Jews that allowed them to take part in this growing leisure culture. We'll also explore how Eastern European immigrants and other American Jews consumed and produced mass culture, but also how they and other immigrant groups served as subjects of early mass culture. So to start, I want to bring back the map that I showed you during our first class, which is the way the Lower East Side, the major immigrant neighborhood in New York, looked around the turn of the 20th century. So this is from circa 1920. It primarily shows two major immigrant groups living in this area, Italian and Jewish immigrants. And I added in a little box at the bottom to show the area that was Chinatown and how it was overlapping with these two immigrant groups' area of settlements. Somewhere between 2,000 and 10,000 Chinese immigrants lived in this area of the city, depending on which statistics you look at. So immigrants started coming over to the United States from China beginning in the mid-19th century, mainly arriving to the West Coast, where they worked in mines, on farms, and building railroads. Because of anti-Chinese discrimination on the West Coast, some migrants made their way to the East Coast, and New York became one major East Coast area of settlement. New York's Chinatown was much smaller then than it is now. There were a series of severe immigration restrictions culminating in the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s, which cut off most immigration from China between the 1880s and the 1940s. So I'm adding in Chinese immigration and Chinatown here to this map, both to give a fuller picture of settlement patterns in this area of the city, and also to show how different maps can tell different stories of an area, depending on what they highlight. So now I'll turn to a map of a different view of the Lower East Side in around the same period, 10 years before, in 1910. This one has bullet points for institutions with their addresses. That's what the little print is addresses. Before I tell you what these institutions are, I'm wondering if you have any guesses. So what do you think these institutions might represent? So if anyone has any guesses, please type them into the chat box.
So we have two guesses. We have movie theaters and religious institutions.
Okay, so the issue with this exercise, usually when I do this in class, I don't tell them the topic of the lecture beforehand. And so yes, you've been prompted. And usually people say that it is religious institutions. And this is a similar map of the Lower East Side in the same period. This is also from 1910, and it shows how many religious institutions were in this area of the city. And you can see all of the Jewish stars are some sort of Jewish religious space. Some of them would have been large, beautiful synagogues. Some of them would have been people praying together in someone's living room. But you can see how densely packed Jewish settlement was in this area from this map. But the map that I was showing you was Nickelodeon movie theaters, so cheap movie theaters on the Lower East Side in 1910. So whoever guessed that was correct. So what this map represents is the number of early movie theaters in 1910. As you can see, there were tons of these movie theaters on the Lower East Side in this period, sometimes multiple on the same block. This gives a sense of just how pervasive these institutions were. And given the demand for movie theaters, the extent to which the mainly immigrant working class population of the Lower East Side was attending the movies. The same was true of other forms of leisure culture. So this map, which is sort of turned the other way, but is a map of Manhattan, shows the number of halls for concerts, dances, and lectures in New York in 1910. Again, you see a big cluster of them on the Lower East Side, showing the extent to which local residents were taking part in these activities as well. And sources by immigrants at this time back up these maps. Even with long hours, low wages, and no previous experience going to the movies, to these kinds of dance spaces, or taking part in these other new leisure activities, working class Eastern European Jews and many other working class groups were taking full advantage of these pursuits. So the ability of new immigrants to participate in these forms of leisure was it was in part related to various economic changes happening at this time. Over the course of the first few decades of the 20th century, the rise of industrial capitalism in America meant that more people were working outside the home, especially younger workers, meaning that there was, for some people, a stricter separation between work and non-work hours. Though many people still worked very long hours in often brutal conditions, even after labor laws tried to ameliorate some of those conditions, there was more space than ever before for people to take part in activities that were not work outside the home. Most American working class immigrant families functioned through a family economy, meaning that fathers, mothers, often children, especially daughters, were all contributing their wages to the home. So this table that's up on the screen right now shows income sources for Jewish and Italian families gathered around 1911. It shows the extent to which children were contributing pretty significantly to the family economy, especially in Jewish households. So there are some issues with this table, as with any kind of table of statistics from this time. For example, the categories are not actually mutually exclusive, so the numbers don't add up to 100%. It also heavily discounts the number of wives and mothers who worked from the home, taking in piecework or subletting spaces to boarders or working in family-owned businesses, or in other ways contributing to the family economy. It also doesn't give us a sense of how families functioned who didn't have all of these family members or who lived in larger family units with uncles, aunts, grandparents, things like that. But it does give us a sense of the general patterns of nuclear Jewish immigrant families in this period. Men were the primary breadwinners, and children contributed significantly to family income. So this pattern of male breadwinners and married women retreating from the formal workforce fit pretty well with prevalent American ideologies at this time that separated married women from the public sphere and from the workforce. But they're actually pretty different from how the average Jewish family functioned economically in Eastern Europe. Life for most Jews in Eastern Europe was highly stratified and patriarchal, but the system of status and gender surrounding the system was different than those in America at this time. So it's worth unpacking this a bit to understand the differences. In Eastern European Jewish society, there was a large gulf between upper and lower classes in terms of wealth, status, privilege, way of life, knowledge. But those at the top of the social pyramid were men with lots of religious knowledge. So religious scholars had the highest degree of respect, and these scholars were supported by community and families. And the ideal gender roles of these people of higher status consisted of men spending as much time as possible learning and women often supporting their family to make this possible. This was very rarely true in practice. Generally, both men and women in a household worked to support their family, but this shows that there was no male breadwinner ideology in this society. And so traditional Eastern European Jewish society had different gender ideals than contemporary middle-class American society, for example. So to give us a sense of this sort of ideology, here's a translation of part of a traditional Yiddish folk song. This sort of source is not necessarily a reliable indication of how Eastern European Jewish society functioned in practice, but it does give us a sense of the gender ideologies at this time. So it's sort of contrasting how men's lives worked and how women's lives worked. So he runs to the synagogue and reads all the laws. He runs here and there, growling like a bear. To market, she must hurry, wood to buy and worry, bread she must bake, kindling she must break, the children she must care for, that's what she's there for. Put this one to bed, smear up that one's head, soothe this one's ache, to the outhouse that one take, and for measure, full or near, a baby every year. And in reality, in most cases, in Eastern Europe, husbands and wives tended to actually work together, either in family-owned stores, inns, taverns, or women working to supplement whatever their husband's trade was. So again, this is another folk song from this time period that gives a sense of these sort of gender partnerships. So cobbler's wives must make the thread, tailor's wives must sit up late, coachman's wives must tar the axle. So they're contributing to the labor of their husband's professions. So this does not mean that women were seen as equals, but because it's important to remember that status in this society was based on religious learning. That was something that most women were barred from. But it led to some amount of familial and economic authority for women, worldliness, knowledge of the marketplace, and often knowledge of other European languages, because they often had to go to the marketplace and barter with non-Jews. So we need to see shifting to an economy of married women in the home and men as the primary breadwinners, not as a timeless aspect of Eastern European Jewish culture, but as something that many immigrants adopted as part of their acclimation process into American society. And this also meant a shift in the demographics of those who were working outside the home. In the garment industry, which was the major sector of employment for most Eastern European Jewish immigrants on the Lower East Side at the turn of the 20th century, the workforce was almost predominantly young and female. Many of these young women lived with their parents before they got married or relatives and used their wages to support their families. For these young women, work was both a constraining and a liberating experience. They worked long hours, often under pretty brutal conditions, but work was also central to their identity formation and also became a central social space where women were introduced to new friends, new ideas, new ways of thinking. There were some important differences between the ways in which smaller and larger factories and shops functioned in this period. Small shops often had a more family-like environment and tended to be less fully industrialized. They were mostly run by people from similar regions of origin. So often in Jewish shops, for example, the conversation during the day would be in Yiddish or in Russian, as opposed to in English. These environments were often less formal, more intimate, often somewhat better working conditions, though this was not always the case. Workers were often allowed to drink, sing, talk, or smoke while they worked, as long as they continued to do their work. So this led to more of a fusion between work time and socializing time, but also longer working hours. These were often, as you can see in this picture, mixed sex environments, which meant that in these environments, young female workers often were facing more harassment than they were in larger factories. And since these were often organized around ethnic lines or religious lines, these sorts of small factories would be more likely than larger factories to be closed on Shabbos, on the Sabbath, which was appealing to more observant Jews. Larger factories, in contrast, often had many more employees, as you can see in this picture here, often much stricter oversight of work, harsh conditions. The work was more brutal, needed more careful attention and speed, less physical mobility while you were working. You were often stuck in one space, and workers were allowed fewer breaks. But actually, most young women tended to prefer to work in these larger places of employment. One, there was more potential for mobility in this kind of work setup. The hours tended to be shorter, even if they were more intense, which allowed more time for socializing in off hours. Almost all of the workforce in these factories, as you can see here, was young and female, because these were often cheaper workers. So for some young women, this was more preferable than a mixed sex environment. These factories also tended to be more multicultural, hiring people from various backgrounds. So that meant that socializing that happened during breaks or after work was often happening in English rather than in Yiddish or Italian. And working in a factory was often a way for new immigrants to learn these languages and to meet new people they wouldn't meet in other social circles. For many, factories became a sort of school when they hadn't been able to actually go to more formal sorts of education. They learned from their coworkers. In her memoir, for example, future labor organizer Rose Pastor Stokes describes learning about socialism from coworkers at her factory. Others describe reading newspapers together, learning how to read, other social activities and educational activities as happening in these factories. So even for young people who were contributing to the family economy, these work and economic patterns opened up more time and space for leisure activities than ever before, especially cheap ones that didn't require a lot of resources. The fact that many of these young women and young men as well were working in shops, not in the home, meant that they were out in the world. And the fact that they were getting wages meant that they potentially had some expendable income, which often led to serious tensions with parents or other relatives over who controlled these wages and how much of the wages should be contributed to the family economy. So they began to take part in various forms of mass consumer culture at this time. So they were buying new clothes, for example. So these are young workers on the cover of The Masses, which was a socialist magazine at the time. You can see that they're very fashionably dressed. The fact that young women were often producing clothes as well as consuming them made factories a prime site for early labor organization as well, and the political awakening for young female workers. So this is a slide talking about the uprising of 20,000, the shirtwaist strike in 1909, which was started by young female workers who were in part protesting the fact that they, with their wages, could not purchase the goods that they were creating. They were also taking part in self-education societies, attending lectures and classes, spending weekends on Coney Island, going to dance halls, and also going to Nickelodeons. And different people saw different pluses and minuses in these new forms of leisure. On the plus side, many of these new activities were seen as moments of freedom, ways to expand their experiences in America. On the minus side, they often led to tensions within families, how to spend wages, for example. Fears by communal leaders about the propriety of these kinds of environments also sort of abounded in this period. So what kind of messages are people getting from movies, from radio, things like that? Is there supervision at these dances? Who's doing that supervision? And would these sorts of activities contribute to the breakdown of communal cohesion? So both of those things are happening at the same time. So these changes in economics and labor also lined up with profound changes in the forms of leisure available to working class Americans. For example, the mass immigration of Eastern European Jews lined up with the invention and proliferation of movies. Various inventors began experimenting with moving picture technologies throughout the 1880s and 1890s, and vaudeville theaters and other entertainment spaces began incorporating early motion pictures into their offerings. Pretty soon, Nickelodeons proliferated in neighborhoods like the Lower East Side. These were often converted storefronts, which charged a nickel for patrons to come in and experience the movies. So in 1911, Mary Heaton Vorse wrote this article describing going inside one of these movie theaters on the Lower East Side and watching a film surrounded by a primarily Eastern European Jewish audience. Vorse herself was not an immigrant and was writing from what was very clearly an outsider's perspective. But even so, this article gives us some sense of what it was like inside these spaces, what movies they were watching, what drew immigrant audiences to these movies, things like that. So I'll read an excerpt of Vorse's article out loud, and I'm curious to hear your reactions to the text afterwards. So outside, the Iron City roared. Before the doors of the show, the pushcart vendors bargained and trafficked with customers. Who in that audience remembered it? They had found the door of escape. For the moment, they were in the depths of the forest, following the loves of Yellowwing and Dick. The woman's voice, so like the voice of a spirit talking to itself, unconscious of time and place, was their voice. There they were, a strange company of aliens, Jews almost all, haggard and battered and bearded men, young girls with their bows, spruce and dapper youngsters beginning to make their way. In that humble playhouse, one ran the gamut of the East Side. The American-born sat next to the emigrant who arrived but a week before. A strange and romantic people cast into the welter of the terrible city of New York, each of them with the overwhelming problem of battling with strange conditions and an alien civilization. And for the moment, they were permitted to drink deep of the oblivion of all the trouble in the world. Life holds some compensation, after all. So what does she see as the appeal of going to the movies? What stands out to you about her description? Again, please type your responses in the chat.
Okay, so the first response is escape.
Yes, definitely one central thing she sees as going on in these movies is a sense of escapism. Going into this space, watching these movies was a way to escape from the drudgery of everyday life.
And then another, while we're waiting for other comments, something that Betty Ruth posted earlier, I think might apply to this question as well. She pointed out that you could say that the film industry helped new Americans assimilate to American culture. So maybe we're seeing that in this passage as well.
Ooh, we'll talk about that a little bit more later on, but yes, that's a really good point. That's one thing that was definitely happening with these sorts of mass consumer culture activities.
Okay, so other comments of what we see happening here inside the theater is familiar friends sharing experiences.
Yes, there's definitely a sense of community that she's saying here. Like some of it is people who don't know each other, and some of it is going to the movies with people you know from your neighborhood. That's very important.
There's also a dimension of language learning and being learning English. And Richard points out that there's also a dimension of imagining yourself as what's on screen. So there's a kind of aspirational dimension.
Yes, I would imagine that was true for a lot of people watching these movies, definitely.
And then there's another comment that's not directly answering the question, but it's about the film industry being dominated by Jewish moguls. So is that something that you want to address now or later?
Yes, I'll be talking about that more a little bit later in the next lecture that I do about film. In this period, that is not true. It becomes true a little bit later. So the first pioneers of film were not Jewish, but very soon Jews start going into the film industry. And we'll be talking about that in, I think, 2 weeks. So I think we can keep going. So Vorse's article is punctuated by these really beautiful, evocative images by Benda, who was himself an immigrant from Poland, though not Jewish as far as I know. And in these images and their captions, Benda highlighted the escapism, which we talked about a little bit, of going to the movies for immigrant audiences. So the caption of this image was they were permitted to drink deep of all the oblivion of the world. And then he sort of contrasts that with an image of the factory. So their sooty fingers rhythmically bending and striking to try to show the difference between the experience of sitting in a movie theater and the experience of being in a factory. So while Vorse's article discussed Eastern European Jews as viewers of early film, they also appeared as subjects of some early films. Many of the first silent films were short pieces without formal plots. They instead featured scenes or events from everyday life or unfamiliar neighborhoods or landmarks. Some of these early films depicted life on the Lower East Side and other immigrant neighborhoods, as these locations were seen as exotic and fascinating. So I'm going to show you a film from 1903 by Thomas Edison called New York City Ghetto Fish Market. While you're watching, I want you to keep these questions in mind that I have up on the screen right now. So what do you notice about the people in the movie? What stands out to you? How do they seem to be reacting to being filmed? Why would Jews have wanted to watch a movie like this? Why would non-Jews have wanted to see it? Because both audiences were watching this, sometimes in the same space, sometimes in different spaces. And how do you view it as a viewer today? I know I've shown this film to undergraduates before, and they had a really hard time accessing this film, just understanding why it would be interesting for people to watch. So I'm curious to see what sort of reactions you have to this film. So let's try to play this now. It's about 2 or 3 minutes long. I think that's probably enough to give you a sense of the viewing experience of this film. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about any of the questions I posed or any other thoughts that you might have about watching this film.
How long is it in its entirety?
3 minutes, and it's all exactly like this.
So in what way would it have been shown? Like alongside longer films or alongside
So most of the early films were this short. So sometimes multiple or sometimes only one of these films would be shown. And this was pretty common of the earliest films not to have any sort of plot, just to show a scene or something interesting, something like that.
Okay, so we're starting to have some comments coming in. The first one has to do with Jews being seen as exotic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so depending on the audience of the film, if the people watching this film were non-Jews living in other areas of the city, that's definitely one lens through which you can view this film. The fact that these people are so crowded together, the fact that they're in an outdoor market that might be seen as exotic in and of itself, this sort of purchasing pattern, the clothes that they're wearing, the way that their hair is styled. For some people, this would definitely be a way to sort of other these immigrants and see them as an interesting, exotic thing to look at.
Right, and so maybe the flip side of that, someone comments that for immigrants, just being the subject in a new medium might itself have been of interest.
Yes, definitely. And I've been wondering watching this, like, if you're watching this in one of those like dozens of movie theaters on the Lower East Side, are you trying to find your cousin, your best friend, your sister while watching this film, which is a very different way of interacting with it than the non-Jewish audiences that we were talking about before.
For sure. Okay, so then a comment that has to do with differentiation within is there's an interesting contrast of well-dressed and less well-dressed, women without hats and women with head coverings.
Yes, definitely. It shows a real diversity of what it meant to be at this fish market at this time.
So then there's also, someone says that it's almost abstract. It's impossible to see each person as an individual. So rather you're seeing a kind of flow of anonymous people. And it's also—
Yeah, there's no one subject of this movie, definitely.
Okay, so people are pointing out, there's a lot of really wonderful comments here. I think I won't read them all, but one person asks about the women, that the women seemed to be on the older side. Do we assume the younger ones were working at factories or at home? And is there an intergenerational shared responsibility for dividing shopping and other chores? Like, can you speak to who's there and why they're there?
It's a great question. I would guess that in most households, the mother and wife, if that's the way the household worked, the mother and wife was the one in charge of most of the household consumption, buying the products, things like that. So that would make sense in terms of those patterns, what you're seeing in the film, definitely.
Yeah, so something that other people are pointing out is that some of the men seemed well dressed, but that's less true about the women.
That's interesting. Yeah, I wonder.
There's some men in bowlers and some men in hats.
So I don't know who these men and women are in this film. They don't tell us, but it's possible that these men are coming from work and going to the shopping on the way home, and these women are housewives who are just going out to the market. Or it's possible that this has to do with like various standards of dress at this time, or it just could be happenstance that the people who they happen to see at this particular moment in the market happen to show these patterns.
I think I've gotten to most of what people commented.
So one other thing that I noticed when I was watching it is that some of the people seem to notice that there is a camera filming them and be looking at the camera.
Oh, actually, somebody did point that out, and I just skipped.
Which I think is really interesting, just thinking about like, what would that be like for them? How are they interacting as being a subject in this film? So over time, films became longer and more plot driven. Some of them drew on plots of vaudeville shows or other local plays or other sources. And like these other forms of entertainment, some of these early films also included stereotypical, often pretty derogatory representations of immigrant groups, including Jews. which influence the plot of the films as well as how the characters are portrayed. So I'm going to show you a representative example of one of these films, which is called Cohen's Fire Sale from Edison Manufacturing Company. It came out in 1907. It's by film pioneer Edwin S. Porter, who also filmed The Great Train Robbery, which was one of the first successful, somewhat narrative films. It's 13 minutes long, so I'm not going to show you the whole thing. So I'm going to give you a bit of context because I'm just going to show you the last little bit of the movie, the last like 2.5 minutes or so. So the film is about a milliner whose name is Cohen, who gets in a shipment of hats that is accidentally taken out with the trash. So he can't recover the lost merchandise, and he comes up with a way to get the money by, quote unquote, accidentally setting his store on fire. So you can already see the kinds of stereotypical tropes about Jews that this film is drawing on, and you'll see many more as the film progresses. So here are a couple of questions that you might want to keep in mind as you watch the film. So what do you notice about how Cohen and his wife are portrayed? What stereotypes might the film be drawing on? What might have been expected to delight audiences of the day? Why would Jews have wanted to watch a movie like this? Why would non-Jews have wanted to watch a movie like this? What might make audiences today uncomfortable? How do you interact with the film yourself might also be something to hear about. So let's play a little bit of this. Okay, so that gives you a sense of Cohen's Fire Sale. It's a longer video, but this gives you a clear sense of what's going on in the plot, what's going on in the stereotypes and characterization going on here. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts when you were watching it. What stood out to you? What questions does it raise for you? How would viewers then have reacted to it, do you think?
So the first comment is that that it's an awful prosthetic nose.
Oh yes, very clearly fake. As are the special effects, which obviously this was a very long time ago. There's a scene, it's a little hard to tell from the clip I showed you, but it seems like in order to set the store on fire, he takes a match and lights a candle that's attached to a cat. And at one point it's a real cat, and very quickly it's a fake cat. So like all of the special effects are very bad. But the nose is very clearly fake. Definitely. And it also looks very similar to caricatures of Jews in political cartoons at this time. That very similar nose shape was going on.
Right. Okay. So in terms of stereotypes, people are really responding to that final scene as being really heavily stereotyped. Jews as cheating, cheap, and scheming. And someone points out that their parents used to sing a song about poof, no candy store. That sounds like it's along the same lines.
Interesting.
So another thing is, someone says it's interesting to see all the folks running with the fire wagons, the voyeurs. And I actually, that connects with a question that I had about it, which was, do we know if that whole scene was staged? In other words, that they got a fire department to pull out all of their equipment and turn on their hoses?
It's a great question. I don't know. And I was wondering when I was watching it too, like, are the dogs real? Are the children, like, are they actors, or are they just like people who are seeing this happening and sort of joining in of their own volition? It's a really good question.
Okay, so I'm trying to see. Elias says that he noticed another store in the background, the Levi brothers. So the setting seems like a specifically Jewish commercial district. It's not just.
It does seem like that, yeah.
Yeah, and that the main character is named Cohen, so it's clearly meant to be like explicitly about a Jew. And people are commenting on the fake. The fake special effects, the fake fire, but surely the dogs are real.
Yes.
Betty Ruth says, Jews who were assimilated into American culture because of earlier immigration from Western European countries would have been embarrassed by this negative stereotype of Jews.
Yes, that's a really good point. So the differentiation between different Jews, one of the things that more acculturated Jews were really worried about is the ways in which negative stereotypes about newer immigrants might redound negatively on them. So it's interesting to think about how they might have viewed this film. It's also interesting to think about how Eastern European Jews themselves might have viewed this film, because they would have been one of the audiences of it, definitely.
Do we have any sense of how it was received by them?
Yes, we'll get to that in a sec. I have a review in one of the Yiddish newspapers that I'll talk about in a second.
Interesting.
But I want to hear if there are any more of your thoughts before then.
Well, yeah, so there's a couple of comments about people just furthering the discussion about tensions between earlier immigrants and later ones. And Larry Silver points out that that's another reason why sometimes people immigrated via Galveston or other places rather than going to the Lower East Side. And actually something that someone else had commented on, and here we have another one, is about how well dressed the women are who come to the sale. So maybe there's a contrast between the customers of a store like this and the sort of cheap and scheming immigrant stereotype.
Right, and given the way that they're dressed and the way that they look, it seems likely that we're not supposed to see them as Jewish, even though we're supposed to see the people who are running the store as Jewish. So this is a space where different people are interacting, which is interesting to think about, again, in terms of commercial culture, like who's interacting with whom in these sorts of spaces.
Right. So there's a question. Can you tell us something about the production of the film? Do we know much?
I don't know much. I know that it's from Edison Company. It's one of the first early films. I've heard that it's based on characters that were popular in vaudeville shows in New York at this time. So these were very common stereotypes and tropes, but Cohen, I think this particular character was a vaudeville character at this time. So it's showing that like all of these commercial spaces have stereotypes of immigrants as part of the culture. So when we talk next time about, or 2 times from now, about Jews as sort of early producers of film and then the rise of Hollywood and things like that, also keep this in mind that like Jews are consuming popular culture, but they're also subjects of popular culture from the very beginning in very complicated ways.
So there is one more comment that this Cohen character has to be understood as already being well settled as well, to have a fancy shop like this rather than be a peddler or a worker in someone else's store. So, you know, there's
That's a good point.
degrees of this.
Yeah, and also thinking about like his knowledge of the insurance companies and things like that would be something he would have gotten in the United States. So thinking about the ways in which this shows both like a way in which he's exotified and othered, but also ways in which you can read it as an understanding of some aspects of American culture, even if that's a very complicated understanding. Great. And so one of the sources that I want to show you next. There we go. So here we have a contemporary response to the film, which ran in the Orthodox Yiddish daily, the Tageblatt. This source appears in Jay Hoverman and Jeffrey Chandler's wonderful book, Entertaining America. You'll read another section of this book in a few weeks, those of you who are doing the optional reading, when we talk about Hollywood and the Jazz Singer. So this source gives us a sense of one reaction by contemporary Jewish audiences to Cohen's fire sale. So I'll read this out loud. One of the latest pictures currently being shown is called Cohen's fire sale. In a very hateful manner, this picture shows how a Jew whose business is in trouble burns down his millinery store. As a result of his cleverness, he makes a considerable profit and gives his wife a large, valuable diamond. A young man, a Zionist, who saw this picture in a Jewish-owned motion picture house, protested against it. He shouted that it was disgraceful to portray Jews as arsonists, but the owner of the theater answered him by shouting even louder that Jews wouldn't be accused of setting such fires if they didn't do it. No one is so quick to set fires as we Jews are. Interesting. The audience, a Jewish audience, found all this very amusing and applauded the owner. The young Zionist walked out to the street defeated, but his heart would not be stilled, and he demanded that the theater take down the sign depicting Cohen the Jew and his wife abandoning their store to the fire. A large crowd gathered, most of them Jews. They listened to both sides, and can you imagine, almost all sided with the owner. What business is this of yours, mister? What makes you the expert about this? The one thing you can do is not go where you don't feel like going. And that sentiment was shared by many Jews in the crowd. It was also the opinion of the policeman who made his point with the assistance of his club. Should one be silent about such things? Should everyone be allowed to spit in our faces? Should Cohen fire sale be presented by Jews? We leave it to our people to be the judge. So I'm curious to hear any reactions you have to this depiction of Cohen's fire sale, how it was viewed, how it was reviewed, and what's going on in this article. There's a lot going on.
There's an early debate over cancel culture.
Yes, yeah, very much so.
So we're just waiting for people to pull their thoughts together. Sure. It's a precursor to Seinfeld, someone points out. There is actually a scene very much like this in a Seinfeld episode. Mm-hmm. So someone says, I find it humiliating. I don't know if you want to comment on that. There's a couple more questions that I can raise. One is that there still remains similarly a pattern of ethnic groups making fun of themselves, but not wanting others to. So that feels like a familiar pattern or paradigm.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting how varied the responses are in this article. How like different people are viewing this film in the same space in really different ways.
Absolutely. And then we actually have a couple questions in a row about the identification of this person as a Zionist.
So, yeah, I'm interested to hear what you think is going on with that. I don't know. The Tageblatt itself was pretty Zionist, but it's interesting that they're talking about him through this lens of politics and national identity when describing his relationship to this film.
Right. So one comment suggests that he's representing a radical rejection of American life, maybe both in terms of the stereotypes and also in terms of the Jewish willingness to accept them or be a part of them.
So that's more our understanding of Zionism today. Back then, Zionism was something that people tried to see as very patriotic and American. You could be very Zionist and very pro-America. But yeah, looking at this through today, it's interesting to see how our understandings of Zionist culture sort of impact our view of this.
Yeah, really interesting. So another comment along those same lines is that the Zionist sees them as Jews, but those who are okay with it might just see themselves as Americans.
That's interesting.
Then somebody says the reviewer seems to be advancing the stereotypes as well. So is the reviewer an American?
So this was, I mean, he was an American Jew writing in Yiddish in the Yiddish press. This is translated from Yiddish by Jeffrey Chandler, who's a professor at Rutgers. One of the things I think is really interesting about this article is thinking about why someone would want to read it and why someone would want to write it. So clearly, he's trying to show some sense of sensationalism here. So he's trying to show the things that are a problem in this movie, but also trying to sort of create a fun, interesting reading experience for his readers. And both of those are interacting at the same time in this piece. So thinking about what's going on in the movie theater, but also what's going on in the article, I think is really interesting. And that's also sort of showing up in the article itself, if you think about it, that one of the things that it's depicting is that there's a spectacle going on that's not the movie, it's the fight over the movie, and that people are coming and watching and contributing to that spectacle as well. And so you can see various ways of interacting with commercial culture all at once. Any other thoughts?
I think they've slowed down now. I think you.
Okay, great. So together, these sources give a sense of the various roles Jews played in early film as subjects, as viewers, as owners of theaters. Pretty soon, Jews also became involved in the production of movies, but I'll be focusing on that topic more in depth in a few weeks, as I said before. So now I'll shift to discussing radio a little bit. So like early film, radio was another mass medium that many working class immigrants and their audiences took advantage of. The heyday of radio was slightly later than early film, really taking off in the 1920s. An obvious advantage of radio was that radios themselves were often relatively cheap. And once you bought a radio, you had access inside your home to all of this content. So on this slide is a table from Elizabeth Cohen's Making a New Deal, showing how pervasive radios were in working class and middle class neighborhoods of Chicago by 1930. Clearly, radios weren't as pervasive in working class areas as they were in middle class areas, but they were still in about a third to a half of all households, which is still quite a lot. Earlier radio programs were often sponsored by consumer goods manufacturers, and advertisers often wrote much of the content of early radio. So this is somewhat similar to the dynamics we discussed in newspapers last week, where there was often an overlap in advertisements and newspaper contents. This dynamic is actually the origin of the term soap opera too, because they were originally radio dramas sponsored by soap companies. Other programs included vaudeville sketches, orchestras, radio plays, a real mix of high and low culture. Many viewed radio as central to the creation of a mass culture in America, which is sort of what we were talking about before. The sense that everyone in every household had a radio and could be listening to the same content contributes to the sense that these new immigrants and others in America were all part of one united American culture. So the same was often said of early movie theaters, that there was a homogenizing character to the fact that everyone was beginning to consume the same media. This was also a way, as we talked about before, for some people to learn English through listening to radio programs or reading title cards in silent films. And many ethnic leaders started to get very worried that consuming mass culture might diminish a sense of community or connection among immigrant groups in America. But this didn't necessarily take into account the locations and environments in which people consumed this media and how that affected their experiences. As we saw in the Vorse article and in the article we just read from the Tageblatt, in areas like the Lower East Side, most Jews were watching movies with other Jews, with other Eastern European Jews, and in theaters that were often owned by Jews as well. So these were very Jewish spaces, even if there was a lot of differentiation between Jews within those spaces. So these spaces could be seen also as crucial to maintaining a sense of communal culture and group solidarity, as opposed to diminishing these things. The same was true of radio, which people listened to in their homes with family, maybe neighbors, friends. These environments also had the potential to shape people's listening experiences. So if someone was listening to radio with their mother or father who only spoke Yiddish, they might spend time translating English language material for them, or they might switch to Yiddish when discussing their favorite radio program after it aired. So this is a really good example that when we're talking about mass culture, it's important to think not just about what creators intended their content to mean, but also the ways in which consumers bring their own agendas and context to this content, and how that can also shape their viewing and listening experiences. So this also, the idea of all of mass culture of radio as homogenizing also discounts the advent of Jewish-specific radio content beginning in the 1920s, especially Yiddish radio. The heydays of the most popular Yiddish language institutions like newspapers and theater were over really by the end of the 1920s, though those institutions continue to exist. But the heyday of Yiddish radio was just beginning. By the 1930s, for example, New York had 23 stations broadcasting some form of Yiddish language programming. These all ran on frequencies that also carried programs in other languages, showing the hybridity of radio culture. And people could turn into one radio station and just tune in for the Yiddish radio programs, or they could listen to content in multiple languages, or they could switch the channel if they wanted to. The fact that Yiddish radio thrived in the 1930s and in the 1940s, even into the 1950s, at a time when new immigration from Eastern Europe to America had been suspended, suggests that many American Jews continued to engage in Yiddish language media even after they had transitioned into living their lives mainly in English. From the beginning, Yiddish radio drew an audience of listeners who were equally comfortable, most of them, with English and Yiddish language media, as well as many listeners who had begun listening to English language radio before the advent of Yiddish broadcasting in the 1920s. So in devising their programming, Yiddish radio stations often drew on pre-existing Yiddish media. The most successful Yiddish radio station was WEVD. It was closely connected to the Socialist Party and was taken over by the socialist Yiddish daily The Forward in 1932. The call sign for the station, WEVD, was a tribute to recently deceased socialist leader Eugene V. Debs, EVD. WEVD also ran a radio installment of The Forward's most famous column, A Bintel Brief. But other newspapers like The Day also expanded into radio as well. Many figures involved with Yiddish theater also worked in radio as a way to supplement their income. Playwright and actor Nochem Stutzkopf, for example, wrote melodramas, and actress Molly Picon performed in Yiddish radio broadcasts throughout the interwar period. So like newspapers and theater, these programs offered a mix of formats and content. There were dramas, comedies, advice programs, variety hours, and advertisements for local and national businesses. While the audience of Yiddish radio began to decline after World War II, some programs continued for decades with a small but still pretty devoted audience, still listening to Yiddish programs into the 21st century. So if you're interested in listening to some old Yiddish radio broadcasts, including advertisements and advice shows, a great resource is the Yiddish Radio Project, which you can find at yiddishradioproject.org. The URL is right there. And for further information on any of the issues that I've discussed today, here are some citations to books and websites I consulted in preparation for this lecture. So to sum up what we've discussed today, we've explored Jews as consumers, producers, and subjects of early mass media, especially film and radio, and how these media served various roles for Jewish immigrants: escapism, introduction to various aspects of American culture, but that these could also serve as activities that maintain ties to family, neighborhood, and community. These examples show how focusing on the engagement of Jews and American mass media shows various facets of the development both of American Jewish cultural practices and of the development of popular culture in the United States. So now I'll shift to questions and comments if anyone has any.
Just wait to see if anybody wants to throw in. All right, so Richard is asking, do we have information on whether Jewish immigrants consumed more, less, or the same as other groups?
That's a great question. It's hard to find that sort of data. There is data that some people say that Jews were more involved in consumer culture, and they know that because the Yiddish press had more national mass-produced goods than other foreign language newspapers at this time, which may be an indication of that, may not, but it's a little bit hard to tell. Like, there aren't great sources of data for these sorts of things, but it's a good question.
And then similarly, how does Jewish production of radio, especially radio shows, compare to that of other ethnic groups? Or were there Italian soap operas similarly, or Chinese radio shows?
That's a great question. I know less about the other groups, but I would imagine, yes, I think every culture was involved to some extent in producing their own radio or other forms of mass media, definitely newspapers as well, and theater.
Okay, so a couple of things. One person is pointing out that the free library here in Philadelphia has Yiddish radio broadcasts in its collection. So if you, so that's easy for people to find. And someone is asking if you could send us the list of references that you just put on the screen. So we'll make sure that that goes out in the next reminder email, or we'll put it in the chat at the beginning of next session. And also, okay, so people are asking for other resources too, maybe a link to the maps that you showed. So we'll work afterwards on maybe pulling together some resources that we can share with people.
Yeah, sure, definitely.
Okay, so maybe this will be the last question because we're about to run out of time, but Elias is curious if the kinds of stories in movies or radio were different from the ones in vaudeville and theater. Was there a substantive
that's a great
or
question.
qualitative shift?
I think it depends on exactly when we're talking about, but all of these were very varied art forms. So like vaudeville included lots of different kinds of plots, as did film and radio. And often there was a lot of hybridity between these different forms. The people who were producing these forms of content often worked in various places and sort of overlapped in what they were producing for these different places. But given what was possible in radio versus what was possible on the stage versus what was possible on film, there are also differences that, like if you can't see anything, you're going to have to change your plot. For example, if you only have the sort of limits of a stage and scenery, that's very different than something which you put on film.
That makes perfect sense. So someone is asking for a clarification, is this Yiddish stage theater contemporary with these films, or whether one came before or after the other?
That will be our topic for next week.
Oh, great.
That's a great lead in.
A perfect way to end in that case. By the way, there's some wonderful comments coming in about people's personal experiences. Well, as always, we'll save this chat and we'll make sure that Ayelet gets to see all of these.
Yes, please.
One of them, by the way, is asking about Philadelphia as a site of immigration, even though most of what you're talking about has been New York. So they're asking if you could bring a little bit of Philly into
sure, I can definitely do that next time. But most major cities had some sort of area that was sort of like the Lower East Side, a densely packed immigrant neighborhood that included a large amount of Jewish settlement as well as other immigrant groups often living in the same area.
Fabulous. All right, so there's just a treasure of remembrances of radio characters and places in Philadelphia. So we'll make sure that we get that to you.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, okay, so with that, I want to thank everybody for coming and for participating again, and we're looking forward to seeing you again next week.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.